You might have seen the headlines flashing across your screen telling you that America suddenly faced a critical shortage of aluminum or that prices for this essential metal spiked overnight. On the surface, it looked like a sudden supply chain hiccup or perhaps a diplomatic spat that went a little too far, but if you looked closer at the numbers and the way the markets actually reacted, you saw something much more significant and, frankly, much more worrying. This was not just a temporary scramble for raw materials. It was a stark revelation of how fragile the American industrial base has actually become and how the tools we usually use to try to protect it, like tariffs and trade barriers, can often end up doing exactly the opposite of what they are intended to do. You were told that these measures were about strength and about shielding American workers from unfair competition, yet the immediate result was a scramble for resources that left American factories vulnerable and American consumers footing the bill. We need to walk through exactly how this happened because it tells a very important story about the difference between political rhetoric and economic reality. When the government announces a tariff, the story is almost always the same. You are told that we are drawing a line in the sand. You are told that by taxing foreign imports, we are going to force companies to buy American, restart idle factories, and bring jobs back to communities that have been hollowed out by globalization. It is a powerful story, and it is one that resonates because we all want to see a robust domestic economy. But in this specific case with aluminum, that story ran headlong into a mathematical wall. The United States simply does not produce enough primary aluminum to meet its own needs. We operate at a deficit, and we have for a long time. So when the policy shifted to aggressively tax imports, specifically targeting our closest trading partner in Canada, the assumption was that the Canadians would have no choice but to absorb the cost and keep selling to us, or that American smelters would magically spring to life overnight to fill the gap. Neither of those things happened. Instead, something far more rational and far more damaging took place. The market did exactly what markets always do when you introduce chaos and higher costs. It routed around the damage. What officially happened was a breakdown in the reliable flow of metal that feeds everything from the Ford F-150 in your driveway to the can of soda in your hand and the construction materials used to build your home. Canada, rather than begging for access to the American market under punitive new terms, simply pivoted. They looked at the global board and realized that if the United States was going to make it difficult and expensive to do business, there were plenty of buyers in Europe and elsewhere who were eager for stable supplies of high-quality aluminum, so they walked away. They diversified their export channels. This left American buyers staring at a supply cliff. Almost overnight, the surplus capacity we relied on from our northern neighbor vanished from our books and was reallocated to competitors across the Atlantic. The immediate consequence was panic. American manufacturers who operate on tight margins and rely on just-in-time delivery systems suddenly found themselves bidding against each other for a shrinking pool of available metal. This is where the surface story of protecting industry completely falls apart. You cannot protect an industry by starving it of the raw materials it needs to function. By trying to shield the small number of companies that produce raw aluminum, the policy effectively levied a massive tax on the much larger number of companies that consume aluminum. Think about that for a moment. For every job in a smelter that might theoretically be saved by a tariff, there are dozens, if not hundreds of jobs in manufacturing, construction, and packaging that are put at risk when the price of their primary input skyrockets. The media often frames this as a fight between nations, framing it as the United States versus Canada, but the real fight is internal. It is a fight between one sector of the economy and the rest of the economy, and in this case, the rest of the economy lost. We have to look at the system behind this because it reveals a profound misunderstanding of how modern supply chains work. We tend to think of trade relationships as static, as if Canada is sitting there waiting by the phone for America to call. But capital is mobile and commodities are global. When you introduce political uncertainty into a supply chain, suppliers do not just sit there and take the hit. They price in that risk. This is a concept that is critical to understand. The price you pay for aluminum or steel or lumber is not just the cost of digging it out of the ground and processing it. You are also paying for the certainty that it will arrive on time and at a predictable price. When the United States government demonstrated that it was willing to upend decades of trade stability on a whim, it signaled to the entire market that the American market is now a high-risk jurisdiction. Suppliers responded by charging what is effectively a risk premium. Even the metal that was available became more expensive, not just because of the tariff itself, but because of the fear that the rules might change again tomorrow. This is the hidden inflation that rarely gets discussed in press briefings. You might hear about the percentage of the tariff, but you do not hear about the surcharge for political instability. And who pays that surcharge? You do. It gets passed down the line, incrementally and quietly, until it shows up in the sticker price of a new car, or the cost of a renovation project, or the price of groceries. The companies involved have no choice. If their input costs go up by 20 or 30%, they have to either cut labor, cut investment, or raise prices. Usually they do a combination of all three. This situation with Canada rerouting its exports to Europe is a textbook example of how rigid political thinking fails in a fluid economic world. The policymakers assumed that the United States holds all the cards, that we are the indispensable customer. That may have been true 50 years ago, but today the global economy is far more integrated and far more competitive. Europe needs aluminum too. Asia needs aluminum. If we make it hard to sell here, the metal flows there. And once those new trade relationships are established, they are sticky. A Canadian smelter that signs a long-term contract with a German automaker is not going to tear up that contract just because Washington decides to change its mind 6 months later. We have effectively pushed our most reliable partner into the arms of other economies, helping them build their industrial base while we starve ours. It is important to understand that this was not an accident or a natural disaster. It was a policy choice. It was a choice to prioritize a very narrow nostalgic idea of industrial autarky over the reality of interdependence. We live in a world where supply chains cross borders multiple times before a finished product reaches your doorstep. Trying to sever those links with blunt instruments like broad tariffs is like trying to perform surgery with a sledgehammer. You might hit the target, but the collateral damage is going to be massive. And in this case, the damage was not just financial, it was structural. We depleted our own reserves, we drew down stockpiles that are meant to buffer against real emergencies, all to paper over the cracks caused by our own policy decisions. We made ourselves more vulnerable to genuine supply shocks in the future because we exhausted our buffer during a crisis of our own making. When we talk about the economy, we often use abstract terms like GDP or trade deficits, but we need to ground this in the mechanics of how businesses actually operate. Imagine you run a medium-sized factory in Ohio that makes parts for appliances. You operate on thin margins. You compete with rivals in Mexico and China. Suddenly, your main raw material cost jumps by a significant percentage, and even worse, your supplier tells you they cannot guarantee delivery next month because the Canadian shipments have been diverted. What do? You cannot just absorb that cost. You cannot easily switch to a domestic supplier because the domestic suppliers are already sold out. You are stuck. You might have to delay a planned expansion, you might have to lay off the second shift, you might have to tell your customers that you cannot fulfill their orders. This is how a policy that is supposed to save jobs ends up destroying them. It creates a ripple effect of uncertainty that freezes investment and kills growth. The irony here is palpable. The stated goal was to make America stronger and more independent. The result was that we demonstrated our dependence and weakened our competitiveness. We showed the world that we are an unreliable trading partner, and we showed our own industries that their government does not understand the basic arithmetic of their business models. We have to ask ourselves why this keeps happening. Why do we keep falling for the same simplistic narratives about trade when the evidence of their failure is staring us in the face? It is because the story of the protective tariff is emotionally satisfying. It feels like we are doing something. It feels like we are fighting back. But economics does not care about our feelings. It cares about incentives and supply and demand. And when you distort those fundamentals, you get exactly what we saw with the aluminum crisis. You get shortages, you get inflation, and you get a strategic realignment that leaves us on the outside looking in. This is the system at work, reacting logically to illogical inputs. Now we have to look at who actually wins in this scenario, because in every economic disruption, there is someone standing there with a bucket to catch the spilling cash. You might assume that if the government puts a tariff on foreign aluminum, all that extra money goes into the public treasury to build roads or schools. That is what you are often led to believe. But the reality is much more cynical and much more profitable for a select few. When the price of imported aluminum goes up because of a tariff, domestic producers do not keep their prices low out of patriotic duty. They look at the market, see that their foreign competitors are now forced to sell at a higher price, and they immediately raise their own prices to match. They effectively tuck themselves right under the tariff umbrella. This means that even if a manufacturer buys 100% American-made aluminum, they are still paying the tariff-inflated price. The difference is that the extra money does not go to the government. It goes directly into the profit margins of the domestic smelters. This is what economists call a windfall. It is unearned income generated not by innovation or efficiency, but by political maneuvering. The domestic aluminum producers saw their profits soar, not because they built better factories or hired more workers, but because the government rigged the price floor in their favor. And what did they do with those windfall profits? Did they invest in massive new capacity to make America self-sufficient, as the politicians promised? No. They did what any rational actor maximizing short-term shareholder value would do. They paid out dividends. They bought back shares. They solidified their balance sheets. They knew, perhaps better than anyone, that this artificial protection was likely temporary, so the smart play was not to sink billions into new capital projects that might take a decade to pay off, but to harvest the cash while the sun was shining. The result was a massive transfer of wealth from the thousands of American companies that use aluminum to the tiny handful of companies that make it. We need to be very clear about the scale of this imbalance. We are talking about a few dozen smelting facilities effectively dictating terms to tens of thousands of downstream manufacturers. These downstream companies employ millions of Americans in the automotive, aerospace, construction, and beverage industries. They are the backbone of the real economy. When their costs spike, they have two choices. They can eat the cost and see their margins vanish, which means less money for wages and hiring, or they can pass it on to you. And in most cases, the market forces them to do a bit of both. This is why you saw brewers warning about the price of canned beer. It is why construction bids for local infrastructure projects started coming in over budget. The cost of the raw material feeds into everything, acting like a hidden tax on consumption that nobody voted for and nobody explicitly approved. This brings us to the question of power and access. How does a policy that clearly hurts so many people and provides such questionable benefits to the nation as a whole become law? It happens because of a fundamental flaw in our political system known as concentrated benefits and dispersed costs. The beneficiaries of the tariff are a small, tight-knit group with deep pockets and a singular focus. They can hire the best lobbyists, they can fund the right campaigns, and they can present a unified front to Washington. For them, this policy is life or death. It is worth spending millions to secure billions. On the other side, the costs are spread out across the entire economy. A few cents on a soda can, a few $100s on a car, a slight delay in a building project. For the average person, or even the average small business owner, the pain is annoying, but rarely fatal enough to trigger a massive political mobilization. You are not going to march on the Capitol because your gutters cost 5% more this year. The system is designed to listen to the loudest voice, not the most numerous one. The aluminum lobby successfully wrapped their profit motives in the flag, arguing that national security depends on domestic production. It is a compelling argument until you look at the map. Canada is not a hostile power. Canada is part of our integrated defense industrial base. We share a border, we share a language, and we share military command structures like NORAD. The idea that relying on Canadian aluminum is a threat to American national security is, frankly, absurd. But it was the necessary pretext to bypass standard trade rules. By invoking national security, the administration was able to use executive powers to impose these tariffs unilaterally, bypassing Congress and avoiding the usual debates where these economic downsides might have been aired. It was a loophole exploitation that allowed private interests to capture public policy. Let us look deeper at the mechanism of how this market was manipulated. There is a pricing benchmark in the aluminum world, often referred to as the Midwest Premium. This is theoretically the cost to transport metal to warehouses in the American Midwest, but in reality, it became a catch-all surcharge that exploded completely out of proportion to actual shipping costs. When the tariffs hit and the Canadian supply was disrupted, this premium skyrocketed. It became a speculative vehicle. Traders and suppliers, sensing the desperation in the market, started pricing in the chaos. The physical metal did not change, the distance it traveled did not change, but the price you paid for the privilege of getting it doubled or tripled in terms of that premium. This is financialization, stripping the value out of the productive economy. The money paid to cover that premium did not dig more bauxite or smelt more ore. It just circulated in the financial sector and the accounts of the suppliers who controlled the inventory. And while all this was happening, what were our competitors doing? This is the part that should keep you up at night. While American manufacturers were bleeding cash to pay for overpriced raw materials, European and Asian manufacturers were buying that same aluminum, often the very Canadian aluminum we turned away, at the global market price. This gave them an immediate cost advantage. If you are making car parts in Germany and your aluminum is 20% cheaper than your competitor in Michigan, you win the contract. It is that simple. By trying to protect the upstream producers, we effectively subsidized the foreign competition of our downstream manufacturers. We gave the rest of the world a discount on the inputs needed to compete against American factories. This creates a slow-motion hollowing out. It does not happen all at once. You do not see factories closing the day after the tariff is announced. What you see is a gradual erosion. You see a company decide to build its next plant in Mexico instead of Ohio to avoid the tariff wall. You see a global conglomerate shift its sourcing away from its U.S. division. You see investment capital flow to places where the input costs are predictable and competitive. It is a death by 1,000 cuts. The jobs that are lost in this process are often high-quality, value-added manufacturing jobs, exactly the kind of jobs the policy was supposed to save. But because these losses are scattered and gradual, they do not make the evening news in the same way a shuttered smelter does. The narrative remains focused on the visible, saved jobs, while the invisible, lost jobs silently disappear from the ledger. We must also consider the damage done to the trust that underpins commerce. Business relies on predictability. When you sign a contract for a year's supply of material, you are betting that the world will look roughly the same in 12 months. When the government intervenes so erratically, declaring allies to be security threats and tearing up trade agreements, it destroys that horizon of predictability. It forces every business to become a geopolitical analyst. A manager at a canning plant shouldn't have to parse the diplomatic mood between Washington and Ottawa to know if they can run the line next week, but that is the world we created. We injected political volatility into the bedrock of the economy. And once that volatility is there, it is very hard to remove. Even if the tariffs are lifted, the memory of the shock remains. Companies will now always hedge against the possibility that it could happen again. They will diversify away from the U.S., they will keep larger inventories, and they will build redundancy into their supply chains, all of which adds cost and reduces efficiency. This brings us to the stark realization of what resilience actually means. The proponents of these tariffs argued they were building resilience by forcing autarky. But true economic resilience comes from diversity and strong relationships. If you have 5 friends who can help you move house, you are resilient. If you alienate 4 of them and force the 5th one to do everything at gunpoint, you are fragile. The United States made itself fragile by severing the network of trade that acts as a shock absorber. When we cut off the Canadian supply, we removed our buffer. We were left with a system that was taut, brittle, and prone to snapping at the slightest pressure. And snap it did. The shortages that followed were the direct result of removing the slack from the system. We replaced a flexible international web of supply with a rigid, insufficient domestic bottleneck. It is crucial to understand that the people running these industries are not villains in a cartoon. They are responding to the incentives we put in front of them. If the government says, "We will protect you from competition," the rational response is to raise prices and take the profit. If the government says, "We will not support industrial upgrading or green technology transition, but we will tax your rivals," then the industry will not modernize. It will just stagnate behind a tariff wall. We incentivized stagnation. We paid a premium for the status quo. We spent the collective wealth of the American consumer to prop up aging facilities and outdated business models, rather than investing that capital in the technologies of the future. We looked backward at the economy of the 1950s and tried to recreate it by force, rather than looking forward to the economy of the 2030s and building the infrastructure to lead it, and the rest of the world moved on without us. Let us bring this down from the high altitudes of international trade strategy to the pavement where you actually live and work. Because when economists talk about market distortions or inefficiencies, what they are really talking about is your money buying less than it did the day before. The aluminum crisis did not just stay in the ledgers of multinational corporations. It seeped into the very fabric of daily life in America, often in ways that were designed to be invisible to the casual observer. You might not have noticed a dramatic press release announcing that the price of your favorite soft drink was going up due to trade policy. Instead, you likely saw what we call shrinkflation. The price on the sticker stayed the same, but the can got slightly differently shaped, or the multi-pack went from 12 to 10, or the promotional discounts simply evaporated. This is how the cost is passed on, quietly, incrementally, and strategically.